In this lesson, we start to talk about identifying requirements. Now, the first two steps that we talked about, where we identified the goals and objectives of the project and we identified stakeholders, both of those steps support identifying requirements. All of the requirements that we're going to identify are going to be traceable back to the goals and objectives. And our stakeholders are the ones that are going to help us identify requirements. So this lesson, we talk about requirements at a very high level. You can literally make a career out of managing requirements. And most organizations call these people business analysts. Essentially, you are the person responsible for identifying, managing, tracking, eliciting, whatever the deal is, you become the requirements manager. So this is a very high level lesson. So this just touches the surface. That is it. I'm just giving you a brief introduction to identifying requirements, since it does support our follow-on lessons of developing a project schedule. So just keep that in mind, very high level. Now, there are two broad types of requirements out there. We've got general requirements and we've got product requirements. Our general requirements are typically going to identify events that we've got to support, such as if we're designing a building, we may have to support one or more design reviews, or we may have to support some kind of joint acceptance inspection. We may be doing some kind of walkthrough inspections. These requirements will typically be levied on us either through a statement of work or through management or just through the normal process that our organization has chosen to manage projects. It's going to spell out those reviews, those events, those inspections that are not part of the description of the products. It's things we're going to do to support the project. General requirements also identify our high-level deliverables. It may say to deliver a final design, drawing package, or something of that nature before work starts, or it may call out that we're going to deliver a doghouse or a structure, whatever the deal is. It's identifying the high-level deliverables. So these are just general requirements, things that we have to do. Then we've got the second type of requirement, which is our product requirements. This is what's going to describe our deliverables. For example, if we're building a doghouse, we may say that the walls must be water resistant. It describes how the doghouse is going to be built or designed. It can also specify some type of design or capability specification, such as the entrance must be 36 inches high by 18 inches wide. So once again, we're describing the product. So we've got general requirements and we've got product requirements. Now, of these two types, general requirements, they're pretty easy to see if we've complied. If the requirement says to host a design review, then we either hosted it or we did not host it. So general requirements are pretty easy to show compliance to. Product requirements, on the other hand, are not that easy. So when we're analyzing our product requirements, the basic rule is that our requirement must be specific and achievable. We want to reduce the possibility of confusion. We don't want there to be some conflict between the provider and us. We want everybody to understand exactly what the requirement is saying. Next, we've also got to think about, how is the requirement going to be verified? Are we going to inspect the deliverable? Are we going to analyze some kind of paperwork? Are we going to demonstrate that the deliverable can actually do what it says it can do? Or are we going to do some kind of accepted test to see if the requirement's been satisfied? Then we've got to figure out, when are we going to do this verification? Are we going to do some kind of inspection? Are we going to do some kind of specific review? Or are we going to host a test event? So that's the basic characteristics of our requirements. They've got to be specific and achievable. We have to know how we're going to verify them, and we have to know when we're going to verify them. And we don't just want to know this, we want to put it on paper. If we don't put it on paper, how are we or our other team members or even the customer or the provider going to know what is going on? We want there to be as little confusion as possible. Everybody should know what the requirement is, how it's going to be verified, and when it's going to be verified. So, when we're talking about being specific and achievable, the product must do something, or the product shall do something. The product must have an entrance of 18 inches wide by 36 inches high, or the product shall be blue in color. Very easy, very specific, very achievable. Then, like I said, they must be verifiable. If we don't know when we're going to verify the requirement, how are we going to ever be able to verify that we were successful or that the requirement's been satisfied? And we want to be specific enough that we have no partial passes or no partial failures. And what I mean by that is, we don't want to mix requirements. We don't want to have a compound requirement. We want to have a requirement that basically says the doghouse entrance shall be 18 inches by 36 inches high, period. We don't want to say the doghouse entrance shall be 18 inches wide by 36 inches high and blue in color. Because what if the dimensions pass but the color does not? We do not want to have a partial pass or partial failure. Make your requirements very specific, single requirements. If it's compound, if there's more than one requirement in the sentence, break it into two pieces. We also want to avoid vague requirements. I've seen requirements in the nature of the contractor shall use the minimum number of pieces required. Well, what is the minimum number? Or the contractor shall make maximum use of the old parts. What is the maximum number? Quite frankly, it's whatever the vendor says it is or whatever the contractor says it is. Be specific. Be specific. The minimum number, the maximum number, they mean nothing. They are ambiguous. And like we already talked about, we want to avoid those compound complex requirements. The system must do this and this, or the system must do this or this. Break them apart into separate requirements. We don't want to have those partial passes or partial failures. Now, the basic life of requirement. We've got the initial requirement. That initial requirement typically gets broken down into one or more derived requirements. And we're going to go through an example of this in the next slide. Each of those derived requirements is going to tie to a project deliverable. We are going to be producing something that satisfies one or more of those requirements. That's why we're doing the project. Everything ties back to requirements. We're not making anything that doesn't trace back to a requirement. And then each of our deliverables, there's going to be a verification method and some kind of verification data that shows that the deliverable satisfies the derived requirements that trace back to that initial business requirement. Now let's look at an example. Our initial requirement for management: construct a doghouse for Fluffy. We derive that into two requirements. The doghouse must be water resistant and the entrance must be at least 36 inches high by 18 inches wide. Our deliverables that trace back to those requirements. We've got a design. We want to see in the design that the entrance is at least 36 inches high and 18 inches wide. Then we want to look at the material list. Are we using water-resistant parts? So we can see just by the design in the material list whether or not the requirements are initially complied to. And then finally, the doghouse itself, the actual deliverable, the product that we're delivering for Fluffy, we can see in the actual product whether or not the entrance complies with the requirements, and we can see if there's been water-resistant materials used. So we've got three deliverables. And then at the verification, we're going to do a design review to review the design to make sure that the entrance complies with requirements. We're going to do a material inspection based on the material list to see if water-resistant materials are actually purchased. Then we're going to do a frame inspection to make sure that the dimensions are correct. And finally, we're going to do a final inspection. So all of those pieces all trace back to requirement number one: construct a doghouse for Fluffy. This is a very high-level description of the life of a requirement. On large projects, this can get extremely complicated. Like I said, you can make a career out of managing requirements. But at that basic level, all of the stuff we're going to do on our project schedule traces back to one or more requirements. That's why it's important for us to understand some of these basic project management principles before we start scheduling. Now we're going to capture and manage these requirements in something called a Requirements Traceability Matrix, or RTM. This is a very simple one, and I've got a template loaded in the Module 1 resources. Very simple. You can add more fields on there depending on the complexity of the project. At the basic level though, we want to have the requirement number, what the requirement is, and remember, very specific and very achievable. Then we want to spell out a verification method, and I talked about four already. We've got demonstrate, analysis, test, or examination. Then we're going to spell out which event. What event are we going to do these verification methods at? There should be no confusion. There should be no confusion at all that we're going to analyze the design at the design review. No confusion. And then assign responsibility. Who is responsible for performing that verification method? If it's the developer, then they're going to produce some kind of report back to me that says they did this, and they're going to certify that they did it. If it's myself, well, then I'm going to have some kind of form that I write and generate that shows that I actually did this, just for that traceability, and later on if we need to go back and audit whether or not the work was done properly. So a very simple, high-level requirements traceability matrix. They can get very complicated though. So this completes our very high-level overview of requirements management. Like I said, this can be a very complicated thing, People make careers out of managing and tracing requirements. But the requirements drive the deliverables. That's what we're getting out of this. The requirements drive the deliverables. The deliverables are going to drive the work, and the work's what we're going to capture in the schedule. So that's why we're talking about this. And the requirements must be specific and achievable. We also have to identify how the requirements are going to be verified. And the final piece of this is well-written project requirements avoid conflict. The better your requirements, the more effective your requirements, the more likely you are to have project success. If you've got confusing requirements, then between the customer and the buyer, there's going to be confusion. And that confusion typically leads to some kind of legal action or some kind of lawyers getting involved, and we don't want to do that. So write your requirements effectively. This is just that high level. So that's it. That completes our high-level overview of identifying project requirements. Now you're ready to jump into the lesson about creating the work breakdown structure.